is not just for children. It may be harder for us as we get older, but having faith is something that we can experience throughout our lives. There's a woman in the Bible. I love her story. And she's described only as a woman who had had a flow of blood. You may be familiar with her story. The Bible tells us that for 12 years, can you imagine? 12 years she had a flow of blood. And she had tried every cure, every treatment, every physician, and she was still very ill. Now the Bible doesn't tell us how she found out about this person, Jesus. But somebody told her about him, that he was a teacher, and that he healed people. She had not seen him with her eyes. She had not touched him with her hands. But she had faith that if she went to him, he would heal her. And that's exactly what she did. She made her way through the crowds, and she got just close enough to touch the hem of his robe. And Jesus turned to her and he said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Probably the person of faith that I know personally was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Grandma Rose. This is a woman who was raised on a farm in Nebraska. She was not highly educated. She was not well-traveled. She was not well-read. But she had the strongest, most unwavering faith of any person I have ever known. I had the privilege of spending I didn't know it at the time, but it was her last weekend on earth. I went up to visit her, and we had an opportunity to sit and talk with one another. And she talked about how faithful God had been to her, and how much he had loved her, and how she was so excited because she knew that it wasn't going to be too long before she would go to heaven and be with Jesus. And sure enough, that night, on Mother's Day last year, she went to heaven. And it was really interesting because at her funeral, after her funeral, my siblings and my cousins and I went to her little double-wide trailer where she pretty much lived the majority of her life. And my aunt said, "Take a memento. Take something with you to remember Grandma." And we went around this little home and realized she didn't have anything. She had very little stuff, things that a lot of people would think were important. But that didn't matter to her because her faith was that God continued to provide for her. That's the kind of unwavering faith that I wish I had. Now, it's the woman who was healed in the Bible, my grandmother, they had faith because they saw what God did in their lives, what Jesus did, healing, provision. But there are times when the healing doesn't happen. There are times when we don't get what we think we need or what we think we want. What do we do when our faith is challenged? What do we do when we face crises? There is another woman in the Bible who I really enjoy reading about. Her name was Esther. Some of you may be familiar with her story. Now, Esther was a Jew, and she lived in the kingdom of Persia. And at the time, her people were not being treated very well. And the king of Persia, as kings do, I don't know why they get the opportunity to do that, but they decide they want a queen, so they sent out for all the beautiful young virgins in the kingdom to come to them. Not sure that that would work on the opposite way, but sure enough, she was beautiful, so she was brought to the king. And of all of these young virgins that were brought to the king, he chose her to be his queen. He didn't know that she was a Jew. He just knew that she was beautiful, and he wanted her. There's Esther, and if you picture it, she's in the palace. She is sitting amongst luxury. She has the security of the king. But then one day her cousin came to her and he told her about a plot against their people. And it wasn't just mistreatment, it was total annihilation, total destruction of her people. Now think of it, she is in the palace. She is the queen of Persia. And now she has a choice to make. Her cousin says to her, "Who's to say that you were not brought to royalty for such a time as this?" But this is her situation. Think about it. She is in the palace. But her people are going to be destroyed. She could take a step of faith. But you have to understand about that time that no one was invited into the presence of the king without his express invitation. and she hadn't been invited to see the king for a while. So here's her choice. She could just step back and say, you know what? I will risk my life. If I go to see him, I will likely die. Or she could take a step of faith, and she could go, risk her life, and possibly save her people. And the Bible tells us that Esther said, I will do what I need to do, and if I die, then I will die. And her step of faith, her strength of faith, saved an entire people. There's another woman who lived last century who is a mentor of mine. I look to her as being the amazing example of what faith under pressure is all about. You may be familiar with her name as well. Her name was Corrie ten Boom. And this is a woman who lived in Holland during World War II. Her family and she were all Christians. They loved the Lord. But they saw what the Nazis were doing to the Jewish people. And they knew that it was wrong, that these people, for their faith, for their heritage, were being arrested and were being put into concentration camps, and they were being exterminated. So her family decided that they were going to do whatever they could do to save as many of these people as they could. So they hid refugees in their home, and they helped them to escape to freedom. Well, someone didn't like that the ten Boom family was doing that, and they were turned in. Corrie and her sister were put into a concentration camp, and they were treated and tortured and misused in ways that we could never, ever imagine. Now, it would be really easy for a lot of us, myself included, to say, well, you know, this isn't the right thing. We were doing something for you, God, and this is what you allowed to happen to us. I don't think I want to serve you anymore. But this woman actually conducted Bible studies in concentration camps. She watched her sister die in that camp. And then when she was finally released, and she tells the story that it was actually a technicality, she found out later that she was scheduled to be exterminated. But God had something different for her. And she spent the last decades of her life proclaiming the faithfulness of God.